So I told earlier that somewhere in the early 90s, I shifted from writing mostly in Dutch to writing mostly in English. And there were exceptions. For instance, The Logic of Care, I published first as De Logica van het Zorgen, and some other things, but by and large my focus shifted. And this was also a precondition for getting grants or for functioning in Dutch academia. Because in the Netherlands, the whole idea that if you would have an academic job, it became impossible to do that, or almost impossible to hold on to just writing in Dutch. And for some people who had jobs, they held their jobs, but to get grants with only Dutch publications was impossible. So there was this whole idea that the sciences are international, and international is English. And I mean, this is highly problematic, of course, and it is also really sad because it completely increases the distance between public debates and academic work. For instance, somebody like my former supervisor Nauta, who I mentioned before, was a real public intellectual. For him, there was hardly any gap between what he did as academic work and what he did as part of public debates, and his orientation was on what do we need for the public debate. And the public debate could for him be international, but that was his orientation. And of course, if you write in English, that is not necessarily complete, that could reach a larger and a wider audience in the Netherlands who technically is able of reading the English, but in practice it doesn't happen. And also all these nice journals that we had that I showed earlier, Crisis, Kennis en Methode, there were lots more in psychology, and they all got really under pressure because the potential audience for them became smaller, and that also meant that the interdisciplinary lines became shorter. Sort of, if a sociologist or a geographer would write in one of these journals, I would otherwise read it, and now what they write in English is not maybe so quickly under everybody's view. So that it had a lot of that kind of negative effects. At the same time, for me, and not just for me, it was also wonderful, because this deep frustration of all this great stuff that we did in Dutch that nobody could read, that went away. And so while, as I told earlier, in '88 I would go to a conference and nobody would be able to read what I did, if in 2008 I went to a conference, people would say, you're the one who wrote that and that. So you would have conversations continuing on work we have been doing. And also what was more important even than sort of is that I could have long-term friendships with German, French, English sort of others and we could read each other's stuff and have conversations and make these added volumes together. So there was both the gain and the loss. But one of the big losses is since, I mean, this is not only happening in the Netherlands. There are places like France where it is possible that it's just large enough so far to hold on to doing most work in French. But if you see in Japan, in Bangladesh, in China, I mean, you name it, in Denmark, in the Nordic countries, in very many places we witness this shift at the moment, that there's this shift, international is English. And on the one hand, there is everywhere this hollowing out of potentially of local public debate, because the line with academia is so much longer. I didn't see how I could remedy that, except from maybe writing something in Dutch once in a while. But the other thing is that what gets lost is what may be said and done in other languages, because there is also in anthropology, there is obviously anthropologists relate to if they study outside of their own country, relate to other languages. And one of the rare fields where people actually go into the effort of learning all these languages and of attending to them. But it risks to be the case as if the language, our language, the language that we write in, would be neutral. And it isn't. And I thought, from my Dutch perspective, I was in a nice, or am in a nice position to attend to that, because it's sort of a pure cultural imperialism that I'm witnessing here. The Netherlands is not short of money relative to its neighbors, but given that there is this language imperialism, that is sort of a purified language imperialism that you can disentangle from other kinds. Let's say for somebody from Bangladesh, the imperialism is all over the place and about everything, but for a Dutch person, it is about the language. And I started to study that, not by complaining, I don't like that as a strategy, but by playing with it. So I wrote a text about the Dutch word lekker, for instance, and showing how it does not translate and what it means to trail that word. And I wrote one with another, but at the same time, that then meant that I entered into all these discussions about language. And while in the earlier work on the semiotic work on ziek is het woord niet, we had just taken the semiotic network for what it was. Now I could no longer do that, I thought, and I really had language in practices, and it was language in ethnographic situations. So for instance, lekker, if in the nursing home the nurse asks to the demented person she's feeding, is it lekker? That is a different type of lekker than when it's not a description, the food was lekker. Tasty would be the rough translation. But if she says that, she's not after a fact, she's trying to encourage the person to like the food, she's trying to increase the enjoyment. So going for words in practices was then the art, and that then also shows that as the practices don't translate, the word doesn't, and vice versa. Which was fun to do in an article I wrote with Matthijs van der Port, one of my colleagues here, whose field is in Bahia, and he had asked, in north of Brazil, and he had asked his friends there to, in an ethnographic experiment, to drink their fruit, or to chupar their fruit. Chupar frutas is like this. And so they had been chupar frutas in front of a camera, and we wrote about that together, disentangling the difference between chupar and comer. And comer frutas would be with knife and fork, so to speak. And this difference was very complex because it was where you did it, what kind of fruit you did it, with whom you did it, what kind of clothes you were wearing, because chupar is messy, etc. and so on. So that allowed us to say there is no such thing as eating. Because when I started to study eating, everybody said, now you have a universal. And I refused that. Eating is not a universal, it is an English word. So my project here is called Eating is an English Word. And I'm at the moment finishing the manuscript on that. The manuscript will have these articles, some that I wrote alone, others like that I wrote with Matthijs or with other co-authors, because that gave me access to other languages. And this is just European languages, because in all cases I can then understand enough of what we're doing to get away with that, to know what we're doing. So it's not, if you would go in linguistics, it's not about langue, it's not about the language as a system, it's about parole, it's about words being spoken in practices. Which shifts, when I started to read up in the literatures on languages in practice, what struck me is that they made the same shift there in the field as, for instance, in science studies, a similar shift to practice. Fairly unrelated. You don't see much quotes from one to the other, but it's a similar shift from langue to parole as from science to science and knowledge in practice. One of the fun ones there is I did with, that will be in that book, I did with Anna Mann, who's from Vorarlberg, which is a region in Austria. And she had been part of the Eating Bodies team, as we called it. It's always nice for guests. We are the Eating Bodies team, and then see if they're still there to come. But anyway, Anna, I thought, was doing a PhD on tasting. She thought she was doing, or she wanted to do, a PhD on schmecker. And we actually found this out while she was working, like 3.5 years, so that was all my fault. I should have found that earlier. But then we decided that she finished the thesis on tasting, and then the summer after that, I had a tiny grant for her to go back to Vorarlberg and to really explain to me what Schmecker was by getting some fieldwork. And tasting in English is to a large extent a factual word. You taste whether there is ginger in the tea or the soup or not. Schmecker is a valuing word. It's from the day go, it is das schmeckt, is positive. And so if you study Schmecker, you study appreciation of food, not something that resembles knowing of food. Now, of course, there are thin lines between knowing and valuing here, but this was really in these words visible. So what we argued with that relatively simple case is that the issue is not their language, the people in Vorarlberg who say Schmecker, but our language. Are we doing research into tasting or into Schmecker? So, and this whole classic they-we distinction, I think it's a good moment in anthropology, and people are doing that in various ways. Of course, there are other people working on that, to shake that up. Because that if I do also ethnography on a Dutch case and have to write about that in English, it's not the situation of somebody from Cambridge telling their friends about the strange things people do elsewhere. I often have no idea what the good word in English is. For the article on lekker, I had to ask a friend who I knew had done fieldwork in English nursing home what an English nurse would say, because I don't know how to translate it. Because the translation is not just the word, it is the situation. What do you say in that situation? But of course, if you don't have that situation, then what do you do in the other language? So, and if I'm writing, am I we or they? I could say I'm we anthropologist, but I don't know what you already know or not. So this whole situation where ethnography could be, or where anthropology could be we talking about ourselves among them, is breaking. And it's, of course, again, the Dutch case is very easy. What we also see is a total shift in the population of people doing the research in the department. We have lots of PhDs who come from various sub-Saharan African countries, who come from Indonesia. I have a good colleague in Bangladesh. So the we-them is mixing, and that deserves attention. So in parallel, as I told you, I'm doing these things in parallel all the time. In parallel, I did an edited book on this topic, and I did it again with John Law. This is after all these years again. And this is the book, and it's called in English, On Other Terms, Interfering in Social Science English. And what you can see on the cover is how the various authors have translated this title into their languages. So as you see, we don't have just the provincial Dutch op andere termen, which would be my glorious contribution. We have all kind of other things that I cannot pronounce and that I cannot even read, because we have Arab, we have Japanese, we have two kinds of Chinese, we have Hungarian, and we have Russian. So we have people who are the authors of this book. There are a few whose first language is English, but they are second authors. They co-author with somebody who is they in terms of English. And we have a little text collectively where we reflect on these translations and show what is lost in the translation or gained in the translation. And what everybody does in their own article is trying to articulate that. John actually, he had over the years edited my work. He had edited for other people as well, for who were not native speakers. He called this his imperialist language duty. Imperialist language duty. Mind you, anybody whose first language is English who hears this, it's a duty to help your friends with the English. But he was by the 2010s collaborating with people whose first language was Chinese, and also with people in North Norway, Sami, and working across those languages. Because if my problem was with Dutch, of course, with those far more so-called distant languages, the problem comes with a vengeance, the issue comes with a vengeance. So we have, I think, really great articles here. There's one by Matt Macharik, where she talks about haraga and reframes migration by using this word that is in Tunisia, and then see how crossing the Mediterranean is something very different if you start in Tunisia. There is Ljuba Česneva and Olga Skol-Česneva. Ljuba Skol-Česneva, and they talk about they were writing about common spaces in Russian buildings and trying to frame that into the English, the commons, but it didn't fit. But that's of course because languages also come with practices. So they present a few Russian terms that are about sharing, that are far richer than this English, and have completely other resonances than the English, the commons. Wen Yuan Lin has a very nice one from working with a doctor in Taiwan who's both a Chinese traditional medicine doctor and a Western trained doctor, where he tries not just to quibble with a word, but tries to shift out of the whole idea very deeply ingrained in a lot of Western theorizing of the battle. My struggle goes out there. And what he tries to introduce is the idea of balance that his informant works with, etc. and so on. But the second layer of all these chapters is in a way that they start to eat at the whole idea that you would have empirical realities that are complex and an analytic language that you can share, that you can have stable analytic concepts. We really dissolve in different ways the fantasy of the stable analytic concept and try to open up ways of doing theory in which there is no stable concept and therefore no universal background, and its comparison all the way through, all the time. That's the story.